The morning of January 12th, 1888 started warm. That sounds wrong given what came next, but it's true. Farmers across Nebraska and Dakota Territory woke up to temperatures in the mid-20s and low 30s. Kids walked to their one-room schoolhouses without heavy coats. Some of them left mittens at home. Teachers across the plains let the fires die down in the stoves because there was no point burning through coal and twisted hay when the air felt almost like October. By 2 in the afternoon, the temperature at one station had already dropped 30 degrees from where it sat at noon. By 9 that night, the same station was reading -11. By the following morning, Fargo was at -47. Neche, up in Dakota Territory, hit -58. The winds hit 60 miles an hour across the open prairie. 235 people died, probably more. The actual count kept rising through late January and into February as search parties found frozen bodies in fields and ditches and barns. The storm had no warning. No one saw it coming fast enough to matter. In a few places, the temperature swung more than 40 degrees in less than 2 hours. This is the story of a 17-year-old girl who was already living alone in a broken-down half-dugout cabin in Custer County, Nebraska, when that storm hit. A girl the settlement had voted to stop helping, and what she had growing underground, what she had built with $6, a borrowed spade, and a single sash of salvaged glass, is the reason several families in that settlement ate through February and March when their own cellars had nothing left. Her name was Marta Vedral. She had arrived in Custer County with almost nothing in the late summer of 1887. Here is what the settlement knew about Marta Vedral when she showed up. She was Bohemian Czech from Moravia, the younger of 2 daughters of a man named Joseph who had come over in 1882 and broken a claim in Colfax County. Her father died in the spring of 1887 from a combination of pneumonia and debt. He left nothing, no cattle, no savings, no standing in any community. Her older sister had already married a man in Schuyler and made clear she could not take in another person. The farm was gone to creditors within a month of Joseph's death. Marta had $9.40 when she started walking west. She had a flour sack with a change of clothes, a knife, a tin pot, her father's old almanac from 1884, and a small envelope of mixed garden seed parsnip, salsify, kale, turnip, rutabaga that her mother had brought from Moravia years earlier, and that Joseph had saved and resaved through every bad season. By the time Marta reached the outskirts of the Liban Creek settlement in Custer County, she had $6.15 left. She had no legal right to file a homestead claim. The 1862 Homestead Act set the minimum age at 21, with an exception for heads of families and for widows. Marta was neither, not technically. She was 17, unmarried, and alone. The land office would not take her application. But the land itself, that was a different matter. A man named Emil Horak had filed on a quarter section 2 miles east of the main settlement the previous year, broken about 8 acres, and built a half-dugout that sat partly below grade into a south-facing slope. He'd dug a cellar to about 3 feet. He'd put in 1 window. Then his wife refused to come from Omaha. He ran out of money for seed, and in the summer of 1887, he signed a relinquishment at the county land office and walked back east. He told anyone who asked that the dugout was worthless. The walls were settling. The roof had rotted in 2 places. The cellar flooded every spring. He'd take whatever someone offered just to be done with it. What Marta offered was $6, not all of it. She kept $0.15. She wasn't certain why, looking back later. Maybe for the walk back if nothing worked out. Emil Horak signed the relinquishment. She moved in, and that was that. Let me describe what $6 bought her. The half-dugout sat about 4 feet below grade on the south-facing slope, which meant the earth bermed up around 3 walls to roughly chin height, and the south-facing wall was nearly full above ground. The sod walls were 24 to 30 inches thick standard construction, cut in 3-foot blocks from the blue stem sod, stacked grass down. 2 courses had settled badly on the north wall, and the gaps had never been rechunked. The sod roof had a canvas layer beneath about 8 inches of sod, but the canvas had torn in at least 2 places, and the sod above those spots was wet and black. One of those spots was directly above where Emil Horak had set up his stove. The window was intact, single pane, roughly 12 by 18 inches, south-facing. Marta noted that immediately. She noted it the way someone notes something that might matter later without knowing exactly how. She spent the first week doing what any sensible person does with a building that wants to fall on them. She fixed the roof. She cut fresh sod from the slope nearby and patched the 2 bad spots, grass side up, packed tight. She remixed wall chinking from clay soil scraped near the creek bottom, mixed with dried grass, and packed it into every gap she could find. The north wall alone took 3 days. She remortared around the stovepipe collar with the same clay mix. The stove itself, a small cast-iron box stove that Horak had left because it wasn't worth hauling, she scrubbed out, checked the draft, and pronounced functional. She had $0 and 15 cents left. No glass for a second window, no lumber for any repairs, no additional iron for the stove. She had what the cabin came with, what the slope provided, what the creek bottom offered in clay, and what she carried in that flour sack. What she was about to do with those things, specifically the south-facing window, the slope, the earth of that hillside, and her father's seed envelope the settlement around her found incomprehensible. By the time she showed up at the Liban Creek Schoolhouse meeting in September 1887, the other families had already formed a working opinion of Marta Vedral. The settlement ran on a rough, informal ledger of mutual aid. You borrowed a neighbour's plough horse. You helped raise a neighbour's barn. When someone ran short on fuel in January, you brought a load of twisted hay or a few pounds of coal. That system worked because everyone put into it. A 17-year-old girl alone in a half-dugout 2 miles east with no cattle, no draft animals, no crop in the ground, and no man's labour to offer was, by that ledger, a liability. A man named August Reinhardt ran the hardware and dry goods store. He was the one who said it plainest at the September meeting. He didn't say it cruelly. That's worth noting. He said it the way a man who has wintered on the plains says practical things. She has nothing to offer this winter, and she's going to need help. We can't carry her. If she makes it to 21 and files proper, fine. But this winter she's on her own ledger. The vote wasn't formal. There was no paper signed, no declaration read aloud. But the meeting ended with an understanding. The Vedral girl would not be turned away from a door in an emergency, but no one was going out of their way. Marta wasn't at the meeting. She heard about it from a Bohemian woman named Clara Novotna, who lived a quarter-mile from her and who, unlike the rest, was uncomfortable with the outcome. Marta said nothing about it that Clara could remember afterward. She went back to her dugout and started digging. She dug the cellar first. That was the decision that looked most wrong to everyone who saw it. Emil Horak's original cellar was barely 3 feet deep. A scrape, really, accessed through a wood-frame trapdoor cut into the dugout floor. 3 feet was the standard. That's what the farming guides recommended. That's what most families had. You dug to 3 feet. You lined the walls with whatever timber or sod you had. You stored your potatoes and cabbage and turnips down there, and through a normal winter it held between 35 and 45 degrees. Good enough. Marta dug to 8 feet. It took her 11 days with a borrowed spade and a bucket on a rope. The first 3 feet came up relatively easy, soft topsoil, then a layer of loam. Below that she hit clay, real clay, compacted and blue-grey, the kind that sticks to the blade in sheets. She kept digging. By 8 feet the clay was cool and damp to the touch, even on the warmest afternoons of September. She widened the chamber at the bottom slightly, a shallow bell shape, and lined the lower walls with flat stones from the creek bed. Clara Novotna watched her haul bucket after bucket of blue clay up through the trapdoor and asked what she was doing. Marta said she was keeping things cold enough to stay warm. Clara did not understand this. August Reinhardt, who rode past one afternoon and stopped, understood it even less. He looked at the mound of excavated clay, looked at the trapdoor, and told her she was wasting the last of her digging weather on a hole that would flood in the spring. What Marta understood without the vocabulary to explain it exactly, but with the specific intuition of someone who had watched her Moravian-born father keep a cellar in conditions nobody around here seemed to appreciate, is this: the earth is not as cold as the air. This takes a minute to sit with because it seems backwards. At the surface in a Dakota or Nebraska January, the ground can be frozen solid to a depth of 4, 5, sometimes 6 feet in a truly bad winter. The frost line in normal years for central Nebraska sits around 40 to 42 inches. But below that frost line, the earth maintains a temperature that barely changes winter to summer. At 8 feet depth in Custer County, Nebraska, the soil holds at roughly 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. The soil has so much mass that it takes months and months for surface temperature changes to penetrate downward, and by the time that cold signal reaches 8 feet, it's been reduced to almost nothing. The earth below the frost line is a thermal flywheel. It absorbs and releases heat so slowly that the seasons barely register. Standard cellars at 3 feet sat right at the frost line or just above it. In a normal winter, that was fine. But Custer County's winters were not always normal. And the winter of 1887-88 was going to be something other than normal in ways that nobody, including the weather watchers at the Signal Corps offices, fully saw coming. At 8 feet, Marta's cellar was sitting in ground that the worst Nebraska blizzard on record could not meaningfully cool. Her food was going to be stored in what was, functionally, a refrigerator that could not freeze. She planted in October. This is where the settlement moved from confusion to open ridicule. By October, the window of reasonable planting had, in the view of everyone around her, been closed for weeks. The frosts had already hit. The ground was going to be locked up hard within a month. Anyone planting in October was either desperate or confused. Marta wasn't planting in the field. She was planting in the ground directly against the south-facing wall of her dugout, where she'd spent a week building something that nobody in that settlement had ever seen before. She had dug a pit against that south wall about 4 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 2 feet deep. She'd packed the bottom with about 16 inches of fresh horse manure she'd collected from the stable of a man named Per Holmgren, who lived a half-mile away and who, unlike most of his neighbours, was willing to let her haul away what he'd otherwise leave to pile up. She'd mixed the manure, roughly 1/3, with dried grass stalks. Then she'd covered it with 4 inches of the best soil she had, the dark loam from the top of the slope, and placed her salvaged window sash over the top, angled at roughly 45 degrees toward the south. That was it. No glass, except the one sash. No additional materials. No lumber framing except 2 pieces of scrapboard she'd salvaged from the dugout's original construction pile. What she'd built was what Peter Henderson described in his 1867 manual Gardening for Profit as a hotbed, a pit frame using biological heat from decomposing manure to warm the soil beneath a glazed sash. Henderson's book had sold over 100,000 copies by 1887. Market gardeners in New York and New Jersey had been using this technique for decades. What none of those market gardeners had to contend with was 47 below at Fargo, but the principle held regardless. Here is the physics. Fresh horse manure mixed with straw undergoes thermophilic microbial decomposition. The microbes consuming that organic matter are exothermic. They generate heat as a byproduct of their metabolism. A properly built manure hotbed pile reaches between 140 and 155 degrees Fahrenheit internally for the first week or two, then settles into a sustained lower range. The soil layer above it warms from below. On a sunny day in October or November, the glass sash traps the shortwave radiation coming in from that low winter sun, which at 42 degrees north latitude sits only about 25 degrees above the horizon in January, but still carries plenty of energy on a clear day and blocks the longer wave infrared that the dark soil radiates back out. Same reason a car parked in the sun on a cold day gets warm inside. The air inside a properly built hotbed runs 30 to 50 degrees above outside air temperature on a sunny day. On a clear Nebraska day at -10 degrees outside, the frame can hold 20 to 45 degrees inside. A turnip doesn't need warmth by human standards, it just needs to not freeze. Marta seeded kale, spinach and turnips into the frame in mid-October. By November she had green leaves coming up through the frame. August Reinhardt rode past and saw the glass sash at the base of the south wall with green things growing underneath it while the surrounding field sat brown and locked. He stopped his horse and looked at it for a long time. He called it a glass trick. Outside the frame, Marta left the parsnips and salsify in the ground under heavy hay mulch. This was a thing her father had done in Moravia. "Leave them in the ground," he'd said. "First hard frost comes and they get better, not worse." He was right, and there's a specific reason why. When parsnip roots experience soil temperatures below about 39 degrees Fahrenheit, an enzyme called invertase activates inside the root tissue. That enzyme attacks the starch stored in the root cells and breaks it down into glucose and fructose. The root is essentially converting its own stored starch into sugar as a cold response mechanism. By January, a parsnip that went into the ground in September with 4% starch has almost no starch left. It's nearly all sugar. The freezing point of that sugar-rich cell sap is lower than 32 degrees. The root doesn't freeze because it chemically changed itself to resist freezing. This is also why parsnips and salsify left in the ground through winter taste sweeter and nuttier than anything you pull before the cold comes. The frost isn't ruining them, the frost is finishing them. The Mandan and Hidatsa people a few hundred miles north had been doing something related to this for centuries. Buffalo Bird Woman, whose full name was Maxidiwiak, a Hidatsa woman born around 1839 near the Knife River in what is now North Dakota, described in detail the underground cache pits her people used to store corn, beans, squash, and sunflower seed through winters that would kill an unprepared settler in a week. Their pits were jug-shaped, roughly 5 to 6 feet in diameter at the widest point and about 4 feet deep, with a mouth only 2 feet across to minimize cold air penetration. Lined with dried grass on the walls and floor, sealed with a hide cover and packed earth, those pits kept shelled corn viable and unrotted through Dakota winters that made central Nebraska look mild. The same principle Marta was working from. Mass and depth buffer temperature. Keep the cold out with the weight of the earth itself. Oscar Will, the seedsman in Bismarck who sold adapted cold climate varieties to Great Plains settlers, had been working directly with Mandan and Hidatsa farmers since the early 1880s. His 1,886 catalogue offered varieties that the Hidatsa had selected for generations, specifically because they matured fast enough for a Dakota growing season and held through cold storage better than anything bred in milder climates. Marta had not bought from Oscar Will. She had her father's Moravian seed, which operated on similar principles, varieties selected across generations by Central European farmers, who also dealt with winters that would kill the wrong crop. She was not doing anything magical. She was doing things that multiple generations of cold climate farming people had figured out, largely independently, through the same basic logic. Winter is not the end of food. It's just the part where you have to understand the physics better than the ground does. November passed, December arrived. The December of 1887 was bad enough to make people nervous. St. Paul recorded 17 cloudy days straight. A blizzard on December 20th through the 22nd dropped 17 inches on central Nebraska. Between January 6th and 11th, Omaha's high temperatures barely got above zero for 6 straight days. August Reinhardt had 4 cords of wood and a full coal box. He was not worried. Per Holmgren, whose manure Marta had borrowed, had 3 cords of twisted hay and a cattle barn that added animal heat to his small frame house. He was not worried either, though he was the one man in that settlement who occasionally wondered aloud what that Vedral girl was doing out east. The schoolteacher, a young man named Carl Steiner, who'd arrived from Ohio that autumn, had enough coal for 8 weeks. He thought that was probably enough. It probably would have been, except that January 12th arrived. You already know what happened that morning. Temperatures in the mid-20s and 30s. Kids walking to school without coats. Carl Steiner at the schoolhouse let the fire burn low. The cold front that swept down out of Canada that afternoon was carrying air that had been sitting over the Arctic for weeks. When it hit the relatively warm air sitting over Nebraska and Dakota Territory, the contrast was severe enough to generate wind speeds the settlers had rarely seen in daylight, sustained 60 miles an hour. Gusts higher. The temperature didn't just drop, it plunged. One station recorded 44 degrees Fahrenheit at 2 in the afternoon and -11 at 9 that night. -42 by the following morning in some locations. Fargo at -47. Neche, Dakota Territory, at -58. The powdery dry snow that came with it was not like a heavy snowstorm, it was more like ground glass in the air. It got into every gap. A man in Lake Benton, Minnesota, later wrote that the snow had blown in through his keyhole and made a pile on the floor inside his locked door. Carl Steiner's schoolhouse, which had a decent stone foundation but gaps in the board siding that hadn't seemed worth sealing in a mild December, had snow blowing in between the boards within minutes of the front hitting. 235 people died. Minnie Freeman, a 19-year-old teacher in Valley County, Nebraska, tied 13 of her students together with scarves and led them through the white wall of the storm to a farmhouse. The story ran in newspapers across the country, and she got called Nebraska's Fearless Maid in a song written about her. Lois Royce, a teacher near Plainview, lost 3 of her students to the cold and lost both her own feet to frostbite. Etta Shattuck survived buried in a haystack for nearly 3 days and then died in early February from infection after the amputations. In the Lieben Creek settlement, nobody died, but the storm hit harder and lasted longer than anyone had prepared for. Carl Steiner burned through his 8 weeks of coal in 9 days, rationing carefully, because the temperature inside the schoolhouse, which was also his residence, dropped to 22 degrees at night when the stove went cold, and he couldn't risk letting it go out entirely. August Reinhardt had prepared well by any reasonable measure and ran through his 4 cords in 3 weeks, then started burning furniture. His root cellar, dug to the standard 3 feet, had its potato supply partially freeze by the end of the 2nd week. When frost reached below 3 feet, which it did in exposed, wind-scoured bare ground by the end of January, the potatoes at the bottom of that standard cellar hit below 30 degrees, and some of them froze solid. A frozen potato thaws to a black, water-soaked mush that rots within days. Per Holmgren's cellar was also 3 feet. His turnips and beets came through. Mostly turnips freeze at 30 degrees, which is below where Holmgren's cellar went, but only barely. His potatoes were gone. Marta's 8-foot cellar registered, at its deepest point, 41 degrees through the entire storm and through all of February. She knew this because she took the temperature with her hand, not with an instrument. She knew the difference between cold enough to preserve and cold enough to destroy, in the way that someone who has spent a Moravian childhood watching a grandmother manage a cold cellar knows it not from a book, but from corrected mistakes across years. Her parsnips had been in that cellar since mid-October. Her salsify, her turnips, her kale, which she'd cut from the glass frame and brought down when the frame's temperature dropped too far in the worst of January's cold, her beets, her rutabagas, several dozen dried corn braids made from seed her father had grown the last season before he died. None of it froze. The hotbed frame had gone dormant by mid-January. The manure's heat had exhausted itself after about 8 weeks. And at -40 outside, even the glass sash couldn't hold above 20 degrees inside the frame. But by then she'd cut everything harvestable from it and brought it inside or down to the cellar. The kale she'd bundled and hung from the dugout ceiling beams where it stayed at roughly 40 to 45 degrees. The earth walls of the half-dugout, doing their own version of the cellar physics, thick soil mass absorbing and releasing heat slowly enough that even in the worst of January, the interior air never dropped below 35 degrees. She ate. Not well, not comfortably, but she ate through all of January and all of February without running short. Clara Novotna was the first one who came. This was the second week of February, after the main cold broke slightly, but before spring was anything more than a rumour. Clara's family had potatoes from her own cellar through the second week of January, and then the cellar had failed and they'd been through the stored flour and most of the dried beans. Her husband had made it to the settlement store twice in temperatures that shouldn't have allowed travel, and each time August Reinhardt had extended credit, but the store itself was running low on certain things, and the supply wagon from the east wasn't getting through the snow-blocked roads. Clara came to Marta's door on a Tuesday morning with 2 of her children and asked if Marta had anything to spare. Marta had a cellar with 41-degree parsnips that had spent 3 months converting their starch to sugar and had never come close to freezing. She had salsify. She had turnips. She had braided dried corn. She had kale that she'd re-rooted in a clay pot near the stove and which was still producing new leaves. She gave Clara a hemp sack with 20 pounds of roots, a corn braid, and a bundle of kale. She didn't ask for anything back. She didn't say anything about the September meeting. She sent the children back out the door with the sack and said the kale tasted better with a little salt if Clara had any. Clara did not forget this. Carl Steiner came 4 days after Clara. He was down to oatmeal and 2 tins of salt pork, and he'd been rationing both for 10 days. He had no cellar at all. He'd moved into the schoolhouse in September and never dug one, reasoning that he'd buy what he needed from the store through the winter. This was not, in retrospect, a sound plan. He knocked on Marta's door and she opened it, and he stood there and said he was looking for food if she had any to spare. She brought him inside and gave him a meal of parsnip soup, parsnips, turnips, dried corn, kale cooked on the cast-iron stove with creek water. He ate it quietly and she watched him eat and didn't say much. When he was done, she packed him a sack of roots and a dried corn braid. He asked her, on his way out the door, what she'd planted in that glass frame he'd seen from the road in October and November. She told him. Kale, spinach, turnips. He asked how she'd known to build it before winter. She said her father had shown her how his mother did it in Moravia. Build the frame against the warm wall, pack the manure in deep, put the glass on at a slope facing south. The manure does the work for the first 2 months, and then the sun takes over. She'd never built one herself before. She'd just watched enough times to remember the angles. Carl Steiner wrote about this conversation in a letter to his family in Ohio that spring. The letter survived because one of his nieces kept it. It's not a famous document, but it gives us the clearest record of exactly what Marta said, as closely as Steiner could recall it. August Reinhardt came in the 3rd week of February. He did not come hungry. He was better positioned than most, and pride was doing some of the work of keeping him from the door. He came because his wife's mother was visiting and was 63 years old and had been sick since January and was not getting better on a diet of salt meat and store flour. And the doctor, who was 30 miles away and not reachable in February, had said in December that she needed fresh vegetables. August Reinhardt stood at Marta Vedral's door and asked if she had fresh vegetables. She had greens. The kale she'd rooted in the clay pot near the stove had put out new leaves twice since she'd cut it in January. She cut a full bundle, about 2 pounds of dark leafy greens, and wrapped it in cloth. Reinhardt paid her. She didn't ask him to, but he put coins on the table anyway, 25 cents. He looked around the interior of the dugout while he did it at the trapdoor in the floor, at the bundles of dried roots hanging from the ceiling beams, at the small clay pot on the table with green things growing out of it, and he didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "That cellar you dug, how deep is it?" 8 feet, Marta said. August Reinhardt looked at the trapdoor for another moment. He said, "I didn't think that was sound reasoning." Marta said nothing. He picked up the greens. He said his wife's mother improved within the week. He told Clara Novotner about it, which is how the story got around. Spring came slowly. March was still cold, still hard, with 3 more minor storms before the first thaw in mid-April. By then, Marta had provided food in some quantity to 4 families in the settlement, plus Carl Steiner and 2 passing travellers who'd asked at her door. She'd kept enough for herself through the entire winter without once running short. The cellar had worked exactly as the physics said it should. 8 feet of earth above it, 41 degrees through the worst winter in a decade. Every root she'd stored in October came out of that cellar in March, still firm, still sweet, still worth eating. The hotbed frame had produced greens through December and into mid-January, roughly 8 weeks of cold weather production from a single sash of salvaged glass and 16 inches of Per Holmgren's manure. The parsnips and salsify she'd left in the ground under hay. Mulch came out of the ground in March, sweeter than anything she'd grown that summer. Their starches fully converted to sugar by 4 months of cold-induced enzymatic activity. Their roots still crisp and unbruised because the hay mulch had kept the frost from reaching them. She filed her homestead claim 4 years later, in 1891, the summer she turned 21. The land office in Broken Bow processed her application on a Wednesday morning in June. She paid the $14 filing fee with money she'd saved from selling vegetables through 4 winters. The claim was for the same quarter section where the half-dugout sat, the same slope, the same south-facing wall, the same ground that had held her through the winter of 1888. By 1891, she'd replaced the canvas roof with boards and a proper sod layer. She'd extended the hotbed frame to 6 sashes and added a second one on the east side of the dugout. She'd dug a second cellar at 12 feet for long-term seed storage, where she kept spare seed in clay-sealed crocks at a temperature that never varied more than 3 degrees across the entire year. August Reinhardt died in 1909 and left a brief memoir that a local historical society typed up in the 1940s. In it, he mentions the winter of 1887-88 and the Czech girl who had the deep cellar, and says that he considered her approach to the winter as good a demonstration of practical sense as he'd seen on the prop, Plains. He spelled her name wrong, but the practical sense part he got right. Here is what Marta Vedral knew that the settlement didn't. She knew that the earth is a heat bank. It doesn't swing with the weather the way air does. The soil at 8 feet stores the warmth of the previous summer and releases it slowly, too slowly for any single winter to drain it. The frost line in central Nebraska sits at 40 to 42 inches under normal conditions. In the winter of 1887-88, with wind-scoured bare ground and weeks of temperatures that hadn't been seen in living memory, that frost line pushed to 5 and 6 feet in exposed locations. Every standard 3-foot cellar in the settlement sat at or above that frost line by February. Her 8-foot cellar sat 18 to 24 inches below even the extreme frost line. The surrounding earth held at 41 degrees throughout. The food never came close to the temperatures at which it would have died. She knew that decomposing horse manure generates heat. Thermophilic bacteria in that manure pile generate enough thermal energy to push soil temperatures to 80 and 90 degrees and hold them above 60 degrees for 6 to 10 weeks. A south-facing glass sash traps the sun's shortwave energy and blocks the long-wave infrared radiating back out from the dark soil. The combination kept green things growing in her frame for 8 weeks while the settlement around her assumed growing season was over. She knew that parsnips and salsify improve with cold. She knew this from watching, not from understanding the enzymatic biochemistry, but the biochemistry is there and it's real, and it explains exactly why her father told her to leave those roots in the ground until after the first hard frosts, and why the parsnips she pulled in March of 1888 were the sweetest thing she ate that year. None of this was secret knowledge. Peter Henderson had published it in 1867 and sold 100,000 copies. Buffalo Bird Woman's people had been doing the cash pit version of it for centuries north of the Missouri River. Oscar Will, up in Bismarck, had been writing about cold-hardy varieties in his catalogues since 1882. Marta's grandmother in Moravia had done the hotbed version for decades. What Marta had was attention. She had watched, she had listened to her father, and, through him, to his mother. And when she found herself alone in a half-dugout in Custer County with $6 and a flour sack of old seed and a settlement that had voted to leave her to her own resources, she built the only system that made sense, given those specific materials and that specific physics. The winter of 1887-88 killed 235 documented people across Nebraska and Dakota Territory. It froze cattle by the thousands, ruined shallow cellars across the northern plains, burned through fuel reserves that had seemed adequate in December, and ended the careers of several settlers who simply couldn't recover from the losses. For the families of the Lieben Creek settlement, it was the hardest winter most of them would ever see. For Marta Vedral, it was the winter she fed 4 families with a glass sash, a borrowed spade, and her grandmother's old parsnip seed. She proved her homestead claim in 1896, 5 years after filing, exactly as the law required. The land office inspector who came out that summer wrote in his report that the improvements were substantial: a frame addition to the original dugout, a root cellar to 12 feet with a board and sod cover, 6 glazed hotbed sashes along the south and east walls, a well to 30 feet, and 8 acres of broken ground with a healthy stand of cold-hardy corn that an old seedsman in Bismarck would have recognized. The inspector wrote that he had rarely seen a more fully improved quarter section for the size of the operation. She kept farming that land for 30 years. If you dig a hole in central Nebraska right now, not a scrape, not a shallow trench, but a real hole, 8 feet straight down, and put your hand against the wall at the bottom, you'll feel earth that's roughly 40 to 50 degrees. Same as it was in 1888. Same as it'll be next January. The seasons don't reach that deep. The ground remembers summer longer than the air does. A glass window facing south is a solar collector that works even in a Dakota January. A pile of horse manure is a furnace that doesn't burn anything. And a parsnip left in the ground through November is sweeter than anything you'll grow in better weather, because the cold finishes what the growing season started. Those things were true in 1888. They're still true. Marta just needed one season to prove it.